right? They will draw fluid into those cells because water tends to follow salt, as I mentioned before, and those cells can swell. You can literally get swelling of brain tissue. Conversely, if salt levels are too low inside of cells in any tissue of the body, but in the brain included, then the cells of the body and brain can shrink because water is pulled into the extracellular space away from cells. And indeed, under those conditions, brain function can suffer. And indeed, the overall health of the brain can suffer. So there are many reports out there indicating, both in experimental models and to some extent in humans, that overconsumption of salt is bad for brain function and longevity. And yet there is also decent evidence in both animal models and humans that if salt consumption is too low, then brain health and longevity will suffer, as will other organs and tissues of the body. So like most things in biology, you don't want things too high or too low. Now, I would say that the vast majority of studies out there point to the fact that a high salt diet is detrimental to brain health and function. Most of the studies have focused on that aspect of salt balance and its consequences on brain function. One critical issue with many of those studies, however, is that the high salt diet is often coupled to other elements of diet that are also unhealthy. Things like excessively high levels of carbohydrates or fats, or combinations of carbohydrates and fats. And so while I know there are many burning questions out there about how much salt one needs if they are on a low carbohydrate diet, or if they are fasting, or if they are on a vegan diet, there have simply not been many studies that have explored the low, moderate, and high salt conditions on a backdrop of very controlled nutrition. And that's probably reflective of the fact that there are not a lot of very well-controlled nutrition studies out there. There are some, of course, but it's very hard to get people to adhere to nutritional plans in a very strict way, and to do that for sufficient periods of time that would allow the various health outcomes to occur. Nonetheless, there's some interesting reports that indicate that the amount of salt intake can indeed predict health outcomes, or what we call hazardous events, things like cardiovascular events and stroke and so forth. And what's interesting is that indeed a lower, I'm not saying low, right, because I don't believe that you want your diet to be truly low in anything except perhaps poison, but a lower salt diet can reduce the number of these so-called hazardous events, but it's a somewhat of a shallow U-shaped function, such that, yes, indeed, a high salt intake can be very detrimental for your health, both in terms of cardiovascular events, stroke, and other deleterious health events. But somewhere in the middle that actually sits quite to the right, meaning higher than what is typically recommended for salt intake, can actually reduce the number of these hazardous events. At least some reports point to that. And so I want to emphasize what one of those particular reports says, and I also want to be sure to counter it from the perspective of the context that that study was set in. Because again, my goal here is not to give you a strict set of recommendations at all. It's to point you to the literature, try and make that literature as clear as possible, and allow you to evaluate for yourself. And I don't just say that to protect us, I say that to protect you, because indeed you are responsible for your health and your health choices. So the paper that I'm referring to is a very interesting one. We, of course, never want to put too much weight on any one report, but this is a paper that was published in 2011 in the Journal of the American Medical Association. The title of the paper is Urinary Sodium and Potassium Excretion and a Risk of Cardiovascular Events. We have not talked much about potassium yet, but sodium and potassium tend to work in concert in the brain and body in order to regulate various physiological functions and health, and we'll talk more about potassium as time goes on.